So the OSPCA was a charity, and it was doing this work because it cared about animals, and it received only a few $1 million from the government for law enforcement every year. It was forced to fundraise from private citizens to pay for the rest of that. So we thought that was a problem, both for the perspective of animals, but also in a democracy, that we would shunt off law enforcement of publicly enacted laws onto this private charity and make citizens pay for it out of the goodness of their hearts.
Welcome to Puppy Killers. This is episode 5, The Law. In this episode, we have the pleasure of speaking with Camille Labchuk from Animal Justice, Canada's leading national animal law advocacy organization. Camille is one of Canada's leading animal rights lawyers and has been working to help and protect animals for over a decade. Camille has a long list of work, from exposing animal cruelty, campaigns against trophy hunting, circuses, zoos, aquariums, shark finning, puppy mills, and more. She is also co-host of the podcast Paw and Order. Thank you so much for being here. Can you just give us a brief overview of Animal Justice and the great work you guys are doing?
Sure. Well, Animal Justice was founded in 2008 by a group of lawyers who saw how bad the legal system was for animals. We've got a problem in this country because we're mostly compassionate Canadians, and we expect that our government's taking care of people and animals who need the help. But tragically, that's usually not the case. We have some of the worst animal protection laws in the Western world in this country. So Animal Justice was founded to try to change that. And since that time, we've pushed for stronger legislation. We saw some huge victories last year in Parliament when federal government outlawed whale and dolphin captivity and shark fin imports into this country. We try to make sure that laws that are on the books when they exist are actually enforced, because far too often enforcement agencies just don't take their job seriously or don't have the resources to do a good job. And we fight for animals in courtrooms across the country too. Now, we're far from the only animal advocacy organization in the country. We've got tons of colleagues in amazing groups, but we are the only national animal law group. Although I should say that there's an organization in Quebec that does some great work on animal law too.
Awesome. So obviously 2019 was a crazy year for you. In 2020, what have we seen as far as animal reform goes, or animal law? I know you said that, I've seen you actually say it a couple times in different interviews, that our animal law is kind of archaic and out of date. So is there any other laws that you think still need to be changed or still need to be worked on? I know that's a loaded question, but
well, where do I start? There's so many.
Yeah, sorry.
I guess the place to start is the fact that most animal use in Canada is just not regulated. In Canada, we've largely let industries that use animals, so whether that's the meat industry, whether that's the animal experimenters, even puppy mills, we largely let them make up their own rules. And I think when people learn the truth about this, they're really surprised to know that, for example, there's no federal or provincial animal welfare regulations for animals used in the meat industry on farms. We would expect that there might be things like minimum space requirements, amounts of light or fresh air that animals should receive, social opportunities that would be required by law. But there's nothing like that. And actually, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but in 2020, we've actually seen a new threat that was previously unexpected in Canada, which is the rise of so-called ag-gag laws. So these are agricultural gag laws that make it an offense to go into places like a factory farm and film animal cruelty. Now, that could include places like puppy mills or pet stores or exotic animal zoos, too, in Alberta, which is also passed ag-gag laws. It's an offense to misrepresent oneself to get access to a facility. So that would make it impossible for an undercover employee to go in there and get footage, even of vicious animal cruelty. So 2020 has not been all good news for animals, unfortunately. But I think when people learn the truth about the fact that there aren't regulations and the fact that the government's not only not regulating, but trying to actively cover up cruelty, people feel really inspired to be part of the difference. So I have seen lots of interest in these issues in 2020.
Right. So, and you guys did you guys spearhead the SPCA changeover to the PAWS Act? Like, did you guys have anything to do with that? Or I know, was it last July or last year, the OSPCA stepped down in like law enforcement or animal law enforcement, and it's now run by the PAWS Act.
We were involved. It was an interesting case. I think in Ontario, a lot of people who dealt with trying to get animal protection laws enforced felt really frustrated by the status quo, the previous status quo. They felt like authorities weren't taking their concerns seriously. And a big part of that was that the OSPCA was seriously under-resourced. Not only in this country do we deregulate animal welfare, we also largely make private charities pay for enforcement. So the OSPCA was a charity, and it was doing this work because it cared about animals, and it received only a few $1 million from the government for law enforcement every year. It was forced to fundraise from private citizens to pay for the rest of that. So we thought that was a problem, both for the perspective of animals, but also in a democracy, that we would shunt off law enforcement of publicly enacted laws onto this private charity and make citizens pay for it out of the goodness of their hearts. We were involved in a court case that sort of prompted some change there, and the OSPCA eventually recognized that it wanted out of the situation. It felt like it was set up to fail, and once it pulled back from doing law enforcement, the government was forced to enact its own special private, or not private, but a public police force run provincially.
So now the laws are obviously more strict and things like that. How's the funding for it, and how does it work on a municipal level? Does the federal government allot a certain amount of funding per municipality, and it's up to municipality to use that funding accordingly? Like, how does it all work? Do you know how the breakdown works?
Sure. Well, I mean, the federal government doesn't really fund animal welfare at all. There's a few bits and pieces here and there, but they wouldn't get involved in funding law enforcement or shelters or anything like that, which I think is not the right approach. I think we should be treating animals like members of our society and individuals who are vulnerable and need care, just as we, take care of children through the foster system who don't have families that they can live with. We should do the same for animals. But instead, it's largely left to the provinces. And the provinces all have sort of idiosyncratic ways of funding this stuff. I would say the major theme is that municipalities don't get much money, if anything, from the province. And instead, they rely on their own tax collection systems to do this work. And when I say do this work, I'm talking largely about shelters and then some local municipal bylaw enforcement. But the provincial enforcement is largely centralized now through this new agency.
Right. Okay. So do you have, as far as like the puppy mill situation goes in Ontario, and it seems to be running rampant, especially with COVID, it seems everybody's getting a puppy these days. Have you had any experience with mills directly, or with, the sale of puppies, and, what's your take on all that? And are you guys doing anything to try and, diminish these places from existing?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right. Puppy mills have flourished in this province. In fact, they've flourished most places in the country, and there's a few reasons for that. I guess the place to start is I keep going back to this idea that animal use is not regulated properly or overseen by the government, and that's absolutely the case when it comes to dog breeding too. So at the moment, Ontario, like most other provinces, doesn't have provincial standards for breeding dogs. There's no requirement to get a license if you want to be a dog breeder. There's no inspection or oversight by the government. So you can imagine exactly why that creates a condition for puppy mills to flourish. If nobody's watching, unscrupulous breeders can do whatever they like, and that's a serious problem.
And why is that? Why is it not regulated? And is it just because there's so many people doing it? It's just impossible. There's no funding. Like, is it a combination of all those things? Like, in your opinion, why is that?
Well, I think it's a combination. So there's a lack of political will. I think governments don't perceive animal welfare issues as important enough sometimes to get involved with. They sort of prefer for industries to go off and make their own guidelines and just, go in their merry ways and do what they want. And I think the way we change that is by making sure that politicians do know that compassionate people in Ontario want to see a better legal system so that we don't have these horrible puppy mill situations that are running rampant and selling dogs on Kijiji and places like that, and keeping animals in like abject conditions behind closed doors. It's so difficult to detect these puppy mills because it's not like they're a place open to the public. They tend to be inside someone's basement or someone's barn that the public doesn't have access to. So usually, unless a neighbor or some whistleblower tells authorities about it, it's not even possible to detect them.
Right. I think even when in that case, like even when there is, reports happening, that sometimes they can't even make it out there to inspect, especially I think before, when the OSPCA was in charge of law enforcement. They could probably only do the really serious ones where, there's dozens or, multiple dozens of dogs being mistreated, right?
Yeah, I mean, they have a real problem of resources with enforcement. If an agency is getting tens of thousands of complaints a year and it can realistically investigate just a couple dozen a day, you can see how that becomes a problem pretty quickly.
Right. So, what do you think the average person can do to get involved in changing these rules and regulations? I guess at their own municipality level, what is this process for the average citizen to get involved?
Well, I would actually focus on the provincial level. And right now, there's a pretty unique opportunity to get engaged with this work and try to make change. So as we discussed last year, the province brought in this new animal welfare system where we've got public inspectors. It also revised the provincial rules for animal welfare, so the offenses and so on. And as part of that whole revision through this new act, the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act, or the PAWS Act, the government's now starting to make regulations that will pertain to specific issues about animals. Now, we're not sure what they're going to do. They've mentioned that they might do something around zoos and exotic animals. We've been really pushing for them to regulate dog breeding as well. And I know that they're now starting to work on producing these regulations. So what an average person listening to this podcast can do at this moment is contact your MPP, your member of provincial parliament, and let them know that you're concerned about the puppy mill situation, about animals being sold unscrupulously on places like Kijiji, and ask them to regulate dog breeding, make sure everyone's licensed, and make sure there's a government inspection system.
And what do you think those regulations would look like? I know you just mentioned that you'd like to see them, be a little bit more strict. In a perfect world, what would those regulations look like for these mills and breeders? What do you think the proper steps would be for somebody to obtain a license or, legally and lawfully be able to breed animals? Or do you just believe cut the breeding altogether? I know you said that you don't like the sale of animals at all for any species of animal, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we've got a serious problem when it comes to the pet industry, which is that people are breeding and producing animals for human use as pets. And, it's a beautiful thing when humans and animals bond and share that relationship. Not all animals are appropriate to keep as companions, so exotic animals, absolutely not. But I think cats and dogs really provide mutual benefits to humans and to those animals. But at this moment, we don't have a shortage of cats and dogs who need homes, who need loving homes and people to care for them. We have a surplus of those animals, actually. And you're right, people have been adopting and purchasing, unfortunately, animals at record rates during the pandemic. And that I think the solution to that, to meet that demand side of things, is to bring animals in from other countries. So there's all kinds of countries that have, again, an overpopulation of companion animals compared to loving homes that they can find for them. And they often bring them into Canada and find them homes here. So I think there's a really beautiful way to do that, which is make sure that adoptable animals find homes. And right. That sort of obviates the need for breeding of animals, which I think is better. But, at the same time, Mark, I do recognize at the moment, dog breeding is still permissible. I don't think that's probably a good thing. But if we were at least to oversee and regulate that industry, we would want a strict limit on the number of animals who can be bred. We'd want a licensing system with strict conditions. We would want regular unannounced inspections of those conditions and publicly available records so that the public, if somebody wants to purchase a dog, they can actually go there and find the inspection report and see what the situation is like. That's not a novel concept. They already have that in the States.
We get emails and messages daily about, hey, is this place a puppy mill? And unfortunately, we don't know every single farm and every single place. So we can sort of offer up some insight of questions to ask and things to stay away from. But the majority of the public don't realize the vastness of this issue like I did. I was completely ignorant to the fact that, I've always heard the term puppy mill and, puppy broker and all those things, but for the average person, they just don't, it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And as soon as if they're searching to get a puppy, they just, they fall in love with the dog, they go and they buy it without any, with any of these things in mind, as far as like the law is concerned and where these dogs are even coming from. So I think partly we're trying to get people on here that, like yourself, to try and teach and inform, and people can do their research. And obviously for us, we just adopted a puppy from Manitoba. So we've kind of switched our mindset in that way as well. So we're hoping we can do that for other people.
I think that's a wonderful thing. Education is a key barrier here. I mean, I know people who are lawyers and involved in animal issues who still purchase dogs from Kijiji. And I think what
Right.
tends to happen is they're looking for a puppy. They kind of go online. They see, puppies for sale, good price. Often the brokers or the puppy mill people will describe those dogs as like, they'll use adoption or rescue terms there to try to dupe people into purchasing them. And then
Yeah.
what happens is a person shows up, they see dogs maybe not in a great condition, maybe in cages, maybe in a kennel, and they think, I just want to rescue this puppy from this horrible place. And they end up making that purchase. And unfortunately, that fuels the demand side of things, and it encourages those unscrupulous breeders and brokers to keep doing their business.
Do you know anything about the Kijiji and how they're still able to be? Because I think somebody told me recently that the U.S. For Kijiji in the U.S. they don't allow the sale of puppies or the rehoming of puppies on their site, but for some reason in Canada it's still allowed. Do you know anything about that, or have you guys even looked into that, their policy on animals?
I'm not sure what the situation is in the US with respect to Kijiji. Actually, an American friend of mine didn't even know what Kijiji was, so I'm not sure it's even got huge uptake there.
Oh, okay.
But I'm sure there's other websites that they use, maybe
Of
Craigslist or
course.
other one. But yeah, so far in Canada, we have not regulated Kijiji sales. But this issue comes up. In fact, I spoke at a council meeting in the city of Orangeville a month or two ago about a proposal that they had on the books to outlaw sales of cats and dogs at pet shops. And the point of that was to shut down puppy mill sales and reduce that supply side issue. But one of the questions from the mayor, I think, actually, was, well, what do we do about Kijiji? So, if we're shutting down these pet sales and encouraging adoptions through pet stores instead, that's great. But what about Kijiji, which is this unregulated open marketplace? And I think the answer is that someone needs to take a look at this and start considering ways to regulate Kijiji. It's a problem, right, from an enforcement perspective, because you've got this vast internet-based website. It's difficult to know who is, selling or purchasing through it because that information is not available to the government. But I think a government that says you simply cannot sell these animals in this way would get a lot of support from the public, and I think it would take a huge chunk out of the puppy mill trade.
Absolutely. And all animals, not just dogs, but it seems like it's a big issue with other animals, like cats and rabbits and literally anything that you can have in your house that seems to be, a big issue.
It's a really good point, actually, because we've seen really good progress. Lots of cities in Ontario and across the country are banning sales of cats and dogs in pet shops, and sometimes rabbits as well. But so far, no one has really taken the step of looking at other animals like birds and exotic animals, because not only is there a problem with how they're sourced, how they're bred, or sometimes plucked from the wild, but also there's this additional problem of them just not being good candidates as pets. They're simply not appropriate to keep in captivity because they're mostly wild animals, and we just should not be keeping them in our homes. So I think, the next wave after cat and dog sales have become increasingly unpopular and even outlawed in many places, I think what we need to look at next is restricting sales of exotic pets as well so that these animals stop suffering.
Right. Speaking of exotic pets, did you guys talk to, is it Phil Demmer, the Smooshy, the marine land activist? He's actually local from just around the corner here from us, and very popular in this area for his work and his, trying to defend his walrus, right? Smooshy, I think, was his main one, and he's also fighting for the other animals there too. Did you guys help him at all? Or I'm sure you know him. You must have some sort of relationship with him, I would imagine.
Yes, I've had the pleasure of knowing Phil for many years at this point, and really admire his work to hold marine land to account for the conditions that animals are kept in there. And you're right, yeah. Phil has had a very special relationship with Smooshy, a walrus at Marineland that he bonded with when he worked there as an animal trainer. And, unfortunately, what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is, Phil's become very concerned about the whereabouts of Smooshy. She gave birth to a baby walrus in the spring or early summer.
Oh, no way.
And which was very surprising because she's the sole walrus left at Marineland. So it's not clear whether they bred her or whether she was impregnated by another walrus before he died. But, obviously an unfortunate situation that a new baby has been brought into captivity, and which is just completely inappropriate for that species.
Right. I thought at one point he seemed optimistic that Smoochie would be released, or like at least sent somewhere outside of where she is now. Is that not going to happen, or?
Well, at this point, people are wondering if she's still alive. Excuse me.
Oh.
No one has seen Smoochie in many months at this point, and Marineland has not released any photos of her recently. So it seems like Phil is deeply concerned that she and potentially her baby are no longer around, or maybe they did ship them somewhere secretly without telling anyone. But yeah, he's certainly been hopeful that they'll find another place for her to go that will allow him to visit her at least.
Yeah, and I'm actually amazed that in 2020 an establishment like Marineland is still operational, especially with all of the protesting that's going on. Clearly, I don't know anybody that goes to Marineland, and I'm in St. Catharines, so I'm not far from Niagara Falls at all. And so I'm just shocked that it's even operational. I have no idea how they finance it even.
It's a great question. I mean, I think the last couple of years, people keep reporting that they see Marineland's parking lot being quite empty. And so I wonder that myself. And obviously with the pandemic, I think they were briefly open this summer, but at reduced capacity. And you can imagine they've taken another financial hit. So I know many people are worried about the fate of the animals there. What happens to them if they close? That's something that we should all be keeping an eye on.
Right. And clearly in the past few years, their funding hasn't been going to the animals, judging by the lack of care and some of the aerial footage I've seen of some of the tanks and stuff. Clearly, they've probably had to put it into like, I don't know if they have loans or whatever, but it's certainly not going into the infrastructure for the animals. That's for sure.
Yeah, they're a private company, so we don't really have any insight into what they're doing or how they're treating the animals. And, you know, again, this brings me back to this provincial effort to make regulations. I have heard that they plan to make regulations about zoos and aquariums. Right now, like puppy mills, there's no license required to run a zoo or aquarium in Ontario, which again is just completely out of step with society's values.
Yeah.
So I think anyone who's concerned about the Marineland situation should really be contacting their MPP once again and asking them to impose requirements.
Now, are they allowed to purchase animals anymore? I thought that it's kind of, there was a law passed where they can no longer purchase dolphins or whales for Marineland and for zoos like that. Is that factual or no? Am I way off?
Right. So you're thinking of Bill S-203. So it was passed last June in Ottawa. So Bill S-203 is a national law that makes it an offense to keep whales and dolphins in captivity and to import and export them except under certain conditions. So really, really strong, incredible progress. It was a groundbreaking move for Canada when we passed that law. But the problem is that there still are 50-some beluga whales, 5 dolphins, and 1 killer whale at Marineland already. And those animals were grandparented into this new provision because obviously there's nowhere for them to go at this point.
Right.
So I think what everybody's hoping is that a sanctuary for these whales is going to open up, or at least some of them can go and have a new home. So really cool progress over the last few years to develop these open water whale sanctuaries. So the idea being that you sort of net off a very large cove. And a group called the Whale Sanctuary Project has actually found a site for this in Nova Scotia. And they're planning to open this up within just a year or two. So incredible, groundbreaking, really cool thing, I think, for Canada to get behind, and a natural next step now that we've taken the step of outlawing captivity.
So now what about breeding? Now, I get that you said that they still have, 50 some odd animals there. So if they can't buy or sell, can they still breed the animals they currently have?
No, fortunately, they cannot breed those animals.
Oh, good.
So, yeah.
So eventually they will run out of their animals to, profit off of there then.
Yeah, and that's the goal, is just to phase out the captivity of these animals. Obviously, it's difficult when there still are some in those tiny tanks. We feel terrible for them, but if we can prevent any new babies from being born into that life, that's a good thing.
Yep. So what does 2020 look like for animal justice for you guys and everything you're doing? What can you fill us in on?
Well, the biggest issue that's overtaken the year for us, I mean, we initially had a lot of comments on the pandemic and pandemic funding that was going to various entities, including aquariums and farms that might engage in poor practices. But what we've really emphasized this year is trying to stop ag-gag laws. So trying to stop those laws that cover up cruelty on farms by making it an offense to expose through hidden camera videos. And unfortunately, Ontario rammed through its ag law in the midst of the pandemic. So June 17th it passed. It will soon become law. It's still waiting for regulations once again. And Animal Justice is preparing to challenge that law in court when it does come into effect. In the United States, that's where ag laws come from. They were passed in response to undercover investigation videos getting on the 6 p.m. news. And lawyers there have challenged and defeated those laws in court because they're unconstitutional. They restrict people's freedom of expression. And in this country, freedom of expression is one of our most cherished rights. I have the right to tell people what happens on factory farms, and listeners have the right to know about how their food is produced. So when you have a draconian law like this that makes it illegal to tell people the truth, that's a huge problem, and we believe it's something the courts need to take a look at.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like on top of the cruelty to the animals and stuff, the amount of disease and problems coming from the beef and the meat that's produced, and people are consuming that. So why would we as citizens not have the right to know what we're eating? It just seems ridiculous.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, food transparency, I think, is really important to people. They want to make sure that when they're purchasing something, they're making an informed choice and not contributing to horrible suffering, to environmental degradation, and even to issues involving worker safety. I mean, we've seen in slaughterhouses the largest COVID outbreaks in the country. And that's because these slaughterhouses are perfect breeding grounds for the transmission of this disease. And, if you've got a law that makes it illegal to go in there and investigate how diseases are transmitted in slaughterhouses, I just don't think people like that very much.
Right. So I guess it's know what you're eating, buyer beware. Don't, obviously buy local. If you do eat meat, try not to support the big factory farms, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's problematic because 99% plus of farming is factory farming, and so even local food there's no guarantee that it's cruelty free, and everyone unfortunately ends up in the same slaughterhouse. So we always tell people it's best if you can to reduce or eliminate your meat consumption, and that's the only safe way to make sure the animal you're eating, or the food you're eating, I should say, was not tortured on the way to your plate.
Right. I think the misconception is not being able to get enough protein if you don't eat meat, right? So I'm assuming that you don't eat meat, I'm right?
No, animal lawyers don't eat our clients.
Oh yeah, really? None? What about fish? Do you eat fish?
No, I love fish.
No?
Fishes are amazing, actually. People don't give them enough credit, but they're quite smart. They're social animals. They form friendships. Some of them have incredible cognitive capacities. And it's difficult for us to connect with fishes because they live underwater. They don't even live in the same environment that we do.
Right.
And unlike mammals that we share a lot of, common sort of body physiology with, and we can empathize with them more easily, it's more difficult for people to connect with fishes. But I encourage anyone who wants to know more about this to read an amazing book called What a Fish Knows by Dr. Jonathan Dockham. He traces all these cool, scientific studies, but also stories of individuals who've connected with fishes. So divers, maybe who go to the same place on their dives every week for a couple of years, and they form relationships with different fishes who live in the area. It's incredible when you start to flip the switch on your thinking and consider these as individuals instead of just, things that get pulled from the sea and eaten.
Right. So is it sort of like an unwritten rule, or that animal lawyers don't eat meat? Or have you met one that does, and how did that go?
I'm trying to think. No, I don't think I have. I mean, I think people who get into practicing animal law do it because they want to help animals.
Right.
And, if you're going to work every morning and trying to fight cases and get laws enforced to protect animals, it's a little bit hypocritical to be sitting down at your dinner plate and eating them. So that's a problem. So, I always say it would be a massive ethical violation for me to sit down and eat my clients every night. So
right, I guess that makes sense. So what else in 2020 can we look for? What are you guys doing? I mean, obviously you guys have the podcast, Paw and Order. So what do you have coming up on the podcast? And is there anything, like I said, anything else in 2020 that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I love one thing I always harp on about, and if you've listened to Paw and Order, our podcast, you've probably heard this before, Mark, and I've said this a couple of times in our interview already, but I really encourage people to get politically engaged if they want to make change for animals. The way I see it, laws in our society reflect two things. It reflect, first of all, our values as a community. So, laws tend to follow our values. When our attitudes change and progress, the laws catch up. So that's good. But they reflect one other thing too, which is the political power of the groups that want a law or don't want a law. And when you've got these corporations, these farming industry interests, these puppy mill breeders who make money from, frankly, harming and exploiting animals, that's a problem, because those people are very motivated to contact their legislators and make sure that the laws are on their side and they can continue to profit and do their business without animal issues getting in the way. So the way that we correct that balance is by becoming more politically powerful ourselves. So that's by organizing, that's by getting together with a group of people in your community who care about puppy mills or marine land or whatever the issue is, and sitting down virtually at the moment with your MPP and telling them that you care about this, telling them that you're willing to go to bat for it, and that your support of them in the next election depends on how much they do on this issue. They need to hear that they could lose support unless they pick up on these issues and carry them.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And I hope you'll come on again and give us an update on everything that's going on as far as, the laws and legislation and all the awesome work you guys are doing. And again, thank you for all the work you're doing, you and your colleagues. It's pretty incredible, the things you've done only in a matter of a couple of years with, the law reform and the enforcement and everything. It's amazing to see that you guys are doing it, and I look forward to seeing what else you guys are up to.
Well, thanks so much for your kind words, Mark, and you too. Thank you for this podcast and for educating people about the problems of puppy mills. This is how social change starts, is by telling people the truth.
Well, thanks so much.